I want to welcome you all to the event Islamic State, Islam and International Law, sponsored by National Security Law Society and our friends at International Law Society and Salimena. And want to, before we get started, of course, today is Veterans Day, so I want to wish a happy Veterans Day. We actually have some, I know, in this room, so raise your hand if you are a veteran in this room. I know we have a couple, so let's give a round of applause. And we actually have a lot of students here at Duke Law School that are veterans, and a lot more that are really interested in matters of national security. And if you're one of them and you're not plugged in yet and you're interested, come see me after the event. Just as an example, last week we went to the ABA National Security Law Conference in Washington, D.C. We brought about 15 Duke Law students, and we were able to go for free thanks to generous funding from DBA and the Center for Law, Ethics, and National Security here at the Duke Law School. And so with that, I want to get started today on the panel. We have two speakers, Professor Laurence Helfer, who many of you know. If you haven't yet taken his international law classes, I definitely recommend them. We're so thankful that you've agreed to come spend some time to talk with us. And then we have Jack Jenkins, who you may not know. Jack Jenkins is the senior religion reporter for ThinkProgress, which is part of the Center for American Progress. And he writes primarily at the intersection of religion and politics. So he'll be talking about the appropriateness of referring to the Islamic State as Islamic, and Professor Helfer will be talking about the international law justifications proffered by the United States for the use of force against the Islamic State. So first up, we'll have Jack Jenkins. He recently published this article, Why ISIS is Not, in Fact, Islamic. It went a bit viral on the internet. So I saw it, and we invited him to come talk to us about this point. And with that, Jack.
It's a relative definition of viral. But first of all, thank you, Danny and company and Duke, for inviting me to speak. So what I'm going to talk to you about is why ISIS is not Islamic and why that matters. And first, as a qualifier, there are a number of different opinions in this space. There are a number of different people with equal amounts of credentials, if not far more than I am, who have opinions about this matter, and I'm just one among many. However, the question behind the question is, why are we bothering to ask this question at all? Why do we care whether or not ISIS is Islamic? And the starting point there is because President Obama, when he gave his speech announcing that he was going to use force to take targeted strikes against ISIS, he justified that claim, justified the use of force against this group by disavowing ISIS as a state, but also as an Islamic entity. And he said ISIL, which is another word for ISIS or Islamic State, is not Islamic. No religion condones the killing of innocents, and the vast majority of ISIL's victims have been Muslim. ISIL is a terrorist organization, pure and simple. It has no vision other than the slaughter of all who stand in its way. And so he made that statement pretty declaratively, and it immediately elicited a reaction within conservative parts of the political sphere. And that's something to be expected. There's a lot of they were going to respond negatively to what he said no matter what. But immediately on Fox News, George Will, who is a conservative columnist, said, ISIS says it's Islamic. Lots of people say it's Islamic. Only the president won't, which is inaccurate. But his point was, clearly the ISIL, the I stands for Islamic. That's what it is. And this may be a perversion of it, but it is, let's just say, a strain of Islam that has recurred. So George Will immediately made the claim that while ISIS might not be mainstream Islam, might not be representative of all of Islam, it is clearly something that is Islamic, and the president should take that seriously. Well, there were several other conservatives that backed George Will up, who made claims against President Obama's idea that ISIS should not be Islamic. And interestingly, the one conservative that came out with him was Rand Paul, who said that ISIS is actually not representative of Islam. But there was also critiques of the left of the president's statements. Bill Maher, speaking the next day in an interview, said there's connecting tissue between ISIS and the rest of Islam. To claim that Islam is like other religions in the sense that it's like nonviolent is just naive and plain wrong. It is not like other religions. Now, Bill Maher took the president's original statement that ISIS is not Islamic disagree with it, and use it as a launching pad for the next couple of weeks to talk about problems about Islam in general. So he went on his show, and there was a fight between, of all people, Bill Maher and Ben Affleck over whether or not ISIS is inherently violent. Whether or not Islam completely is inherently violent. And so he used this entire conversation to say that liberals should be blasting ISIS, but also Islam completely, because ISIS is Islamic, and it's endemic, it's expressive of an endemic problem within all of Islam. So then finally, there was another prominent scholar named Reza Aslan, who was asked by Huffington Post and several other groups to comment on this. And he had very strong feelings about Bill Maher's comments on whether or not ISIS is representative of all of Islam, and whether or not the cruel, terrible things that are done by some people who claim to be Islamic are really representative of what the greater understanding of Islam is or should be. But he did not say that ISIS is not Islamic. Instead, he said, I understand that sentiment of saying that ISIS is not Islamic. ISIS's notion of reestablishing slavery as part of Islam. I mean, if you know anything about Islamic history, the very first thing that Muhammad did was outlaw slavery. Nevertheless, there is no such thing as a Muslim pope. There is no such thing as a Muslim Vatican. No one gets to tell you who is and who is not a Muslim. So if a member of ISIS says, I'm chopping off infidels' heads because I'm Muslim, and Islam tells me to do so, you got to take his word for it. He's a Muslim, and that's his representation or interpretation of Islam. Now, Reza Aslan is a scholar of religion and is a Muslim. So his voice mattered more to other Muslims, but precisely because he is a Muslim. We'll come back to why that is. But so you have this whole conversation around that's like academics and scholars and pundits and whatever Bill Maher is, talking about whether or not ISIS is Islamic. And undercutting that is, why do we care? Like, why is it actually important to distinguish whether or not this is a representation of the Islamic tradition? And the reason is roughly threefold, particularly for Muslims. Firstly, there's a deep-seated need to seek theological consistency within a global religious body, right? So if I'm Muslim and someone does something so abhorrent within my tradition that clearly contrasts with what I understand my religious tradition to be, I'm going to want to decry that. So there's like just a religious impulse on the part of many Muslims to say, no, these guys are not Islamic. Secondly, there's a geopolitical reality here, which is that Islam has very powerful expressions in various parts of the world. It's a minority religion in some countries like our own, but it's the majority in whole states throughout the Middle East and in Australasia. So we have this geopolitical stake in trying to make sure that this one group that is trying to become a new Muslim state doesn't hold claim over the rest of Islam throughout the geopolitical space that is the Muslim world. And thirdly, if you undercut the argument that ISIS is Islamic, that helps you combat their key recruitment tool. Because most of the folks who end up going over to join ISIS they're not really in a good space to begin with. But a religious claim in saying that I am a Muslim, you are a Muslim, come join us in this pure expression of Islam that is ISIS, if you have something to counter that within Islam, you can help combat their main recruitment tool. So while there was this whole high-level conversation in the United States about whether or not ISIS was Islamic, in the rest of the Muslim world, there wasn't as much disagreement. This is a very short, abridged version of the number of organizations and individuals who have declared ISIS either explicitly or implicitly as un-Islamic. You had virtually every American Muslim organization signed on to letters or proclamations that this group is not representative of Islam. You have Dar al-Ifta, which is functionally Islam's Harvard, or perhaps more accurately, Islam's Duke University. They not only did they say that ISIS is not Islamic, they have an international campaign pushing for journalists to not use the term ISIS, ISIL, or Islamic State. They have an alternative phrase that roughly translates as an al-Qaeda breakaway in Syria and Iraq. So the acronym is QSIS. And so they're pushing hard for that. A bunch of imams in England have another name as well. They said you should call it the un-Islamic State. And so they're pushing for journalists in the United Kingdom to use that title. the number of muftis, which is like someone who's given authority within Islam to issue fatwas, they have like a whole lot of religious authority, have decried it. I mean, the most mufti of the muftis, Egypt's Grand Mufti, has come forward and condemned them and said that they're not Islamic, as have these others, and this isn't even a full list. So you have this cornucopia of folks within the Muslim world who are so quick and so intentional to say, look, not only are these folks in Iraq and Syria terrible, not only what they're doing is abhorrent, but it is not representative of Islam, and they are un-Islamic. So, but that still doesn't answer the question of whether or not ISIS is Islamic. And the answering that question is difficult because religion, by definition, has multiple different interpretations. There are going to be a variety of people all over the world who have different perspectives given their context. And so if you really want to answer the question of whether or not ISIS is Islamic, you actually get into the question of what is religion. Because that's what's really undercurrent, that's the undercurrent within all of these different perspectives that we've heard in the American media and abroad. As these are different interpretations of how we understand religion. Context matters deeply. And this is a debate that has been going on in religious studies for a long time. One of the more famous ones, and it gets a little theoretical, but come with me, is this great debate between Clifford Geertz and Talal Asad. They're two anthropologists, both of which talked about the definition of religion. And Clifford Geertz had this long 5-point, it's not long when written like this, but he takes one point and then writes a chapter about it, definition of religion. And you can read through that and pull from that, but the point was that he had a clear understanding for him about what identifies something as a religion. That was in the 60s. In the 80s, Talal Asad, another anthropologist, read Clifford Geertz's definition and then offered a scathing critique. He didn't disavow him fully, but, and this is my old religion professors, we get very upset about the gross overgeneralization that I'm going to give you, so just don't tell them. But basically, his main critique was that religion is very hard to define outside of context. And when we come to the table to talk about religion, people like Clifford Geertz aren't aware of the fact that they're coming with their own frameworks for how we should define religion. So what that means is, if you look through this and if you read Assad's critique, he says that ostensibly Clifford Geertz is appealing to secularism, with secularism in the United States of America is deeply informed by a development of liberal Protestantism. And so the definition of religion that Clifford Geertz has is effectively like overlaying whole sections of mainline Protestantism over other religions to decide whether or not they do or do not count. And you can see that in the comments that we saw earlier. Bill Maher, after he made those comments about the president being naive for calling ISIS Islamic, talked at length about how he rightly so said that in Saudi Arabia there have been a number of beheadings as well. And so no one talks about that. There's a whole larger geopolitical critique there about why that is. But in so doing, he said, there should be more outcry because this is like the Muslim equivalent of the Vatican. Saudi Arabia holds Mecca. Well, that's not true at all because Islam doesn't function like the Vatican. Islam doesn't function like the Catholic Church. Islam, despite ISIS's best claims to the contrary, has no central religious authority. It has multiple different authorities that are in conversation with each other, but there is not one central entity or individual that holds unmitigated sway over all of Islam. But because Bill Maher came to that conversation with his specific concept of what religion looks like and what it is or isn't, it didn't quite encapsulate what Islam looks like. And then meanwhile, Reza Aslan, when he said that if a Muslim says he or she is Muslim, we have to take them at their word. That comes out of a whole other slew of critiques that have happened over the last few decades. Reza Aslan and I share an alma mater, and we're taught by roughly the same people. And so there's a few different things that I'll read into what he's saying. And I'll put the asterisk saying that these are my opinions about what's going on there. But postmodernism and postcolonialism were valid critiques of a lot of things in society. And among them was the critique that guys like Clifford Geertz or Talal Asad or anyone who is in academia in a position of power who decides for someone else what they are or they are not, that can be easily exploited into a system of oppression immediately. And so it behooves us to just take people at their word and say, look, if you're Muslim, you get to be Muslim. If you're Christian, you get to be Christian. And I don't get to tell you whether or not you are or not. And also, Reza Aslan is a sociologist of religion at heart. And that if you're a sociologist of religion, you don't want to get into the conversation about what does or does not count. Because you have a spreadsheet where you've had a poll and people said, hey, I'm a Muslim, or I'm a Christian, or I'm a Jew. And that's what you're going to take from that. And then you're going to process that through your algorithm and come out with poll results. So the problem there is that that logic is from a really good place. The idea of like, we don't want to be oppressive. But where that hits the wall is when something like ISIS happens. When you have a group of people who are killing children, who are using rape and sexual slavery as a weapon, who are slaughtering innocents, and who are slaughtering their own religious people. The Muslims are the main group that have been slaughtered by ISIS at this point. And if religion doesn't have the ability to converse with itself and say, well, we're not really sure what that is or is not. I can't tell you you're not a Muslim. Then that means the term Muslim and the term Christian, the term Jew actually doesn't mean anything. Because if you're not allowed to say that killing children and crucifying soldiers is outside of the bounds of your religion, then what is the functional point of religion? It functionally loses its efficacy. Religions have an efficacy in a theological sense with the divine and their conversations with all things that are transcendent. But here on earth, if they don't have some sort of power, they're literally a useless distinction. And so my position on this, and this is roughly a retelling of my piece from before, is that religion is ultimately a conversation between an individual and a group. And that means a community. And whenever you have the conversation about who's in and who's out, it should always be the last resort to exclude or to kick out or to demean. But something like ISIS calls into question the idea that no one should be condemned. And so, for my purposes, I think that using terms like the Islamic State and ISIS and ISIL is useful to help people understand what something is. Like, this is a title that a group uses. But if I'm asked directly whether or not I think ISIS is Islamic, I would side with the overwhelming majority of the Muslim community, at least their leadership at this point, who has said, no, they are not. And I think taking those communities seriously is something that is very important. And I say that fully understanding that I'm a white, straight American Protestant male, and that my voice only has so much resonance in that community. But everyone should be able to have an opinion, and everyone should be able to operate with an opinion. And I think you should take the opinions of those who are most deeply affected by something seriously. And in that context, I believe that ISIS is not Islamic. Okay.
Thanks, Jack. And I forgot to mention his alma mater he referenced was the Harvard Divinity School with Reza Aslan. And now, Professor Helfer.
Sure.
Thank you.
So the title of my talk should have been Why the Islamic State is Not a State, and then it would have been perfect in comparable. Because in fact, that is one of the relevant considerations here in terms of analyzing the international legal issues with respect to the military use of force by the United States and its coalition of allies in Iraq, but in particular also in Syria. So I can just show you, I hope. Yeah. This was a map of the airstrikes by the United States and allied forces in Syria on the day that they began in the 23rd of September of this year. This had followed 6 weeks of intermittent U.S. bombing of Islamic State forces in Iraq. And this was a very significant move for the United States to begin striking ISIS targets, and also, and I'll say a little bit more about this later, another Islamic group, the Khorasan group, in northwestern Syria. You can see that next to the city, west of the city of Aleppo. Now, the response to this by a number of governments, most notably the government of the Russian Federation, was quite critical. So you can see here, I'm quoting from a statement of the Foreign Ministry, that in connection with these attacks launched by the United States, Russia would like to note that such attacks can be carried out only within the framework of international law. This implies not just notification, which, by the way, was something the United States did do, but also the existence of explicit consent of the Syrian government or a relevant decision of the UN Security Council. Now, I'll come back in a little while to why I think Russia's stringent assertion of compliance with international law is a little bit of the pot calling the kettle black. But we can at least see here the initial response of one set of actors. And I'll talk a little bit more about the rationales that, in a moment, that the United States has put forward in order to justify its authority. And indeed, this devolves into what I think is probably the most important contemporary question, large question regarding the use of military force in this beginning of the 21st century, and that is, when are states able to use force, either alone or in combination with allies, in the absence of a UN Security Council resolution. I know I have a number of my students and former students in the audience, and they know that the Security Council generally has a monopoly on the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, with a couple of exceptions that are quite narrowly construed. And I think those exceptions, although they have lasted the test of time during the post-World War II period and the Cold War period, they have not, in fact, perhaps survived to the current move to a more multipolar world. And I think that's quite challenging. And so what I'd like to do in my remarks today is to analyze, to lay out for you and then analyze the various international legal arguments that the United States could plausibly assert to defend its use of force against the Islamic State in Syria, even in the absence of Security Council authorization. To do that, I'm going to need to step back a little bit in a moment and talk about the UN's collective security system and then the pressures that are leading it to, I think, become close to it breaking down, and how that will affect international legal issues going forward. Now, I should say there is a separate set of issues here involving the domestic authorization for the use of force. I'm not going to address those really in detail in my remarks, except to say, with respect to the issue of whether the Islamic State is Islamic, it's kind of interesting that President Obama would say that, given that one of his initial claims for domestic authorization was that the Islamic State was somehow derivative of or linked to al-Qaeda, which, as far as I understand it, the president has never said is un-Islamic.
Right.
So on the one hand, as a rhetorical matter, he's saying that the Islamic State is un-Islamic, and yet he had to claim some kind of connection to existing terrorist organizations in order to make out the claim that he had the authority under U.S. law to engage in these sorts of bombings. The last thing I'll say on the domestic authorization is that it's quite interesting that the proposals that are now coming to the fore, proposals for draft legislation from Congress authorizing the use of force against the Islamic State in Syria explicitly, rather than relying on the post-9/11 and Second Gulf War authorizations of the use of force, a number of them do contain a geographic limitation, or the phrase that this authority from Congress to the president, this delegation of power, it must be consistent with international law. So in some sense, the domestic question, at least in part, gets wrapped up in the international question. So let me turn to that international question. And what I'd like to try to do is explain why some of the legal arguments that we will consider are stronger or more persuasive. And by that I mean that they are grounded in more well thought through and supported references to the text of the UN Charter, to widespread state practice, and are backed up by prior precedents in similar or at least analogous situations. On the other hand, we'll try to distinguish those sorts of arguments that are weaker or stretch the boundaries of existing law or aren't well grounded in factual situations. And I think that skill, which government officials, international lawyers, and others, I think, need to have, is going to become increasingly important in the absence of an authoritative institution to make decisions regarding the authorization for the use of force. In a certain sense, we didn't have to look into many of these issues when the Security Council was actively managing global hotspots that required the use of force, because if you had the authorization, it was clear the Security Council had that power. In particular, notwithstanding the provisions of the UN Charter that prevent the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, and that limit the United Nations jurisdiction in matters that are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state, all of that can be overridden by a Security Council resolution under Chapter 7 of the Charter authorizing all necessary means. So in a sense, the idea that we would question what all necessary means were, or whether the Security Council had correctly determined that there was a threat to or breach of international peace and security, in some sense, we didn't have to go through that exercise because procedurally it was proper, and there really wasn't as much of a debate about the substance. In the absence of that, we really need to look at the grounds for unilateral use of force and collective use of force outside of the Security Council and evaluate their bona fides. So some of the narrow exceptions that are relevant are individual self-defense and collective self-defense. Those are grounded in the text of the Charter. Less grounded in the text, but equally well accepted, is the idea that a state can consent to the use of force in its territory. And indeed, the 6 weeks of bombings that preceded the U.S. airstrikes in Syria were carried out with the express consent of the Iraqi government. There's also a kind of emerging humanitarian exception that has its most well-developed feature in the rescue of foreign nationals who are held hostage, but that might be emerging more broadly in the principle you may have heard of, the responsibility to protect, which has been invoked in a number of instances by the Security Council and even more frequently by other actors with respect to actual or imminent atrocities against civilian groups. Now, interestingly, as I'll say in a moment, the United States did not rely on any sort of humanitarian rationale with respect to the use of force against the Islamic State. It didn't have to do that in the context of the rescue missions for the Yazidi group because Iraq had again already given its consent, and consent to activity within a particular country is sufficient. So that's one question. The other question, which will come up, is how immediate is the threat or use of force that might justify self-defense? So the Charter makes clear that if there's an armed attack, then self-defense, individual or collective, is permitted. Similarly, if an armed attack is imminent, it's generally thought over time, and there are a number of instances of practice that support this, that you would also be able to use force. But to what extent do we push back that time frame? And we'll see the United States doing that in just a moment. So let me run through a number of the rationales for you, the first being collective self-defense. And here I put up the letter from the U.S. representative of the United States to the United Nations, Samantha Power, and she references the serious threats that Iraq is facing and the fact that Iraq has asked for the U.S. assistance to carry out strikes against ISIL or Islamic State sites and military strongholds in Syria in order to end the continuing attack on Iraq, to protect Iraqi citizens, and ultimately enable Iraq to perform its task of gaining control of its borders. So there are a few different issues here with respect to collective self-defense that I want to interrogate for a minute or two. So first, with respect to Iraq on its own, no one disputes that Iraq has suffered multiple attacks within its borders. Indeed, it's estimated that the Islamic State controls about a quarter of Iraqi territory. Nor is there any doubt that Iraq could defend itself against Islamic State forces, including, if necessary, taking the fight onto Syrian territory where Islamic State forces have retreated to regroup and attack again. So there's no doubt that Iraq could have responded itself if it had the means and the motive to do so. The Charter also makes clear that there will be situations where states are weak on their own and will ask for assistance. And though the nations that will engage in that collective self-defense are permitted to do so, provided that the requisites of self-defense are met. And here's where I think things get really quite interesting. Because the United States, if its basis for intervening in Syria through airstrikes is that it is assisting Iraq, then the United States can only use such necessary and proportionate force to end the hostile activities in Syria that are threatening Iraq. In other words, if the United States' objective is, as I think it's fairly clear to say from some of the administration statements, to wipe out and get rid of the Islamic State, the current international law justification is not sufficient. Safe havens or military operations that are not immediately threatening or closely linked to being a threat to Iraq, the United States cannot rely on collective self-defense to use force against those targets. And so that, I think, is a very important point. It's sort of a subtle point. I think it's missed very much in the current kind of popular news media debates about these issues. And I think the administration doesn't want, at the moment, to put too fine a point on this. But with respect to collective self-defense, one question is the geographic scope and the purposes for which it's being used. A second question is even more contentious. And I want to show you another slide from Ambassador Power, which references collective self-defense and which goes on to refer to threats in states where the government of that state is unable or unwilling to prevent the use of its territory for attacks by private terrorist networks. So here the United States is saying, well, wait a minute, we get to begin this campaign against the Islamic State, not because the Syrian government has consented, but rather because it is unable and unwilling to engage ISIS forces itself. Now that's kind of remarkable if you think about it for just a moment, because the Assad regime is no friend of the Islamic State. So in terms of unwilling, it seems quite strange to say that the Assad regime is not interested in combating the Islamic State. In terms of inability, we really don't have much in the way of state practice other than the United States' own previous interventions invoking this argument post 9/11 in Afghanistan, when the Taliban were harboring al-Qaeda training camps, and also the mission with respect to Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. Again, the unable or unwilling argument has been raised there. So if Assad has said, as there have been some indications, the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, has said, work with us, right? We have some forces. We can help to take out the Islamic State. That doesn't resonate for the United States politically, but legally it might be relevant to an assessment of whether a country is unable or unwilling to respond to a particular attack. And I think here's where I suppose I get the most worried, in the sense that if you consider all the places around the world where states don't have some control over parts of their territory, either because of an insurgent group or a breakaway region that is attempting to assert some kind of autonomy. if you think about all of the different places in the world where that exists, you can begin to see in part how dangerous an open-ended unable or unwilling test would be. Indeed, Russia might have made the same argument, although likely not factually supported, with respect to, and in a way I would say it sort of gestured at that argument. It didn't frame it quite the same way. The argument being that the Russian speakers in Crimea and in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine were at risk of violence or harm, and that the Ukrainian authorities were unable or unwilling to protect them. So that would seem to fit within a framework that the United States is advocating. So I guess what I'm really urging is that there be some kind of mechanism for dealing with this sort of standard. Now, how might that actually happen? Well, it could happen through the kind of evolutionary force of responses by other governments, reactions thereto by intergovernmental officials. That's the way in which customary international law forms. It tends to be messy. It tends to take time. It tends to lead to divergent views during the process, during the period of time when the custom is forming. And with respect to that, I found it quite interesting that on the same day, the Secretary General of the UN used phrases that referred to the United States having initiated military actions in Syria. Sorry, I missed, wrong one. Come back to the other one in a moment. This is, the Secretary General's statement. I note that the strikes in the middle of the paragraph took place in areas no longer under the effective control of the government. This is a nod by the Secretary General toward the unable or unwilling standard. Now, the other way that this could be negotiated would be through some type of agreement, whether a multilateral treaty, which I think would be very hard to negotiate. That is, if you can't really amend the problems with the structure of the UN Security Council, I think it's unlikely to get some sort of binding treaty with respect to the unable or unwilling standard. I do, however, think that it's possible that there could be a kind of non-binding or soft law agreement or a set of best practices or standards that might be developed among different governments, maybe starting with those individual nations that are part of the coalition that the United States is in partnership with now, or perhaps starting with a regional organization like NATO, and then that becoming a kind of focal point or anchor for the practice to evolve over time, so that there are some settled expectations about what kinds of use of force are permissible and what are not. Now, let me just go back for a moment to this last statement by Samantha Power, which refers back to the attacks on the Khorasan group near to Aleppo. So, Ambassador Power refers to a different justification for the use of force. This is a terrorist threat that this particular group, which is linked to al-Qaeda, poses to the United States and our partners and allies. So this is a claim of self-defense that's being made by the United States. Notice this is not linked either territorially or by justification to the defense of Iraq. This is a claim that the United States is itself under threat from this particular group. Now, whether that's indeed true or not, I think will depend on exactly what sort of intelligence information later comes to light that seems to suggest that, in fact, some attack by this group on the United States was imminent. So I've looked at a couple of different official statements that reference an advanced plan for attack involving a bomb that could pass undetected through airport security systems by, this is how detailed it was, lacing non-metallic objects like toothpaste tubes and clothing with explosive material. So that sort of planned and well-developed threat of use of force might meet the kind of imminent standard that would allow the United States to take action against a terrorist group even before an attack had occurred. So I'll close here by just saying a couple of words about the challenges of thinking about law in this kind of international arena. A lot of commentators are kind of categorical in one way or another. That is, they say, there's really only one way forward, and that's through the United Nations, and so we need to move through that no matter what. That's the structure we currently have, and that is the best thing we have, even if it's imperfect. But they're quite categorical that you need a Security Council resolution. Others are dismissive of international rules in general. This is all about power. There are no constraints that international rules actually impose on behavior. And I would say to you that to be wary of both perspectives. Even in this area of where power obviously matters a great deal, we do see nations resort to arguments based on international law and indeed are willing to cooperate in some areas like peacekeeping, like post-war reconstruction, indeed in areas like terrorism. So at just about the same time that the United States was espousing this claim and Russia was opposing it, the Security Council unanimously adopted a resolution on preventing and punishing the involvement of recruits to terrorism. So individuals in Europe and the United States who are going over to Syria and Iraq to fight for the Islamic State. So in some areas, you actually get real traction. In those areas where politics and law are, thinly separated by just a thin film of between them, then I think what really needs to be emphasized is the idea that self-serving arguments need to be interrogated very closely. So those arguments that create uncertainty or ambiguity, either because they are based on a lack of credible factual development, or because they assert claims that mix and match theories in order to get a particular result, I think that is going to be harmful not only for the international system, but also for the state that is espousing those arguments. Because if we are in a world where there are more hotspots of potential violence or threats from terrorist groups or other types of organized activities that can lead to harm, then we really do need to think about what sorts of metrics or rules we should put in place in order to deal with them in a way that maximizes international welfare and national welfare over time. So I'll stop there.
We have a few minutes left and want to open up to some questions.
Yeah, for Professor Helfer. So could there be international law justification for the U.S. Action in Syria based on non-public consent?
Non-public consent. So in other words, if there's been some secret agreement with respect to that, right? So the reason I'm pausing is because there are a couple of separate kind of questions here that we need to unpack. So as far as I'm aware, we've never explicitly had a requirement in international law that consent be public. The public nature of the consent that we have seen has in part been related to the idea, which is fairly well developed, that the consent has to be voluntary and given by the right actor. So normally, if that happens, the consent will be made public, right? So the two usually flow together. But if indeed there is consent by the relevant actor that is in private, I think you get two separate questions that follow from that. So one is, if as in Syria you have a situation where parts of the territory are not under the effective control of the government, does that private or secret consent extend to those territories? And second, what would that sort of hidden consent do with respect to the government's public ability to challenge the legal justifications that are offered? So if you do have this consent rationale, but you can't talk about it, it becomes really quite challenging to justify your actions in the time. Ex post, right after the fact, you can go back and talk about them. So how you actually, I'm trying to think as a practical matter, even if you say that so private consent is permissible, what do you do in that period when the consent is not being disclosed? So from that, you might deduce a couple of principles. You might deduce, even though we've never seen a practice like this before, Peter, you might deduce that this isn't a workable standard, so we shouldn't have it. So consent would have to be public in order to make this work. Alternatively, you'd have to maybe have a situation in which there might be overlapping rationales, right? Consent might be one basis, but you also have, as with the situation here, collective self-defense. So you can rely on one public theory, and when you get to the edge of that theory, you may have some ability to then invoke the second hidden theory. I'm really thinking it's a great question, and I'm thinking out loud, because we really don't have any precedent that says consent must be public.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much.
Wait,
Don't
go too fast.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was gathering my thoughts together. So
There you go.
for the first speaker, I was thinking that you mentioned that how a Muslim person can kill kids, women, other Muslims. And I just had a conversation with one of my classmates from Afghanistan yesterday on this topic. We can testify here. So the thing is that, there are bad things that happen in each religion. In Christianity, we had Inquisition. In Muslim world, unfortunately, we have these problems. And I think I would disagree with you that we cannot call it Islamic. I would call it radical Islamic to kind of narrow it a little bit. But still, there are problems within minds of the members who get too radical out of their beliefs.
Right, and I think for a lot of people, there's an end to which it goes beyond radical into a place where it cannot be condoned by the rest of the tradition, where it doesn't. It is so extreme that it is something different. It is no longer a part of the tradition that they originally claimed. Absolutely, and this is a conversation that's happened before within Christianity for a long time. Even the shooter who killed about 75 people, I think, was in Norway. I'm trying to remember. Mm-hmm. He claimed a Christian identity. It was an interesting one, but immediately we had these conversations in Christianity as well. We said, well, he's clearly not Christian. And this is an interesting conversation, a difficult one to have, because what you're getting at is the idea of no, you should still be culpable for things that happen within your tradition at some point, right? Like we all have problems, and if you have a lot of problems, Christianity had to deal with some serious violent stuff for a long time. Obviously, you can harken back to the Crusades, or you can harken back right now to the Lord's Resistance Army in Western Africa that enslaves children and gives them AK-47s and makes them go back and kill their own parents. And they do that under the name of Jesus Christ. So there's obviously things that happen within various religious traditions. But when you have a unique instance where you have an entire global entity, multiple global entities that are condemning one specific one group of people who are claiming their religious tradition, I think my argument and the argument of those various Muslim groups, who clearly are not, like other Muslims don't necessarily agree with them, but their argument is that at some point there should be a line. Because if there is no line, if there is no point where you can say that is no longer an Islamic act, that is no longer an Islamic entity, then those titles don't mean anything. I was referencing that earlier, because that means you can say that you are a Muslim and do whatever you want. And as long as you self-identify as a Muslim, no one can ever call into question your Muslimness.
So I have to just add in on that a little bit. I'm wondering how much of this is a meaningful distinction versus a semantic one. And I know that semantic distinctions can have meaning. But whether you say un-Islamic or radical Islamic, or whatever extremist Islamic movement, the possibility for critiquing and challenging the actions of the group remains. And I almost would think that if you externalize them and make them kind of part of an other, then the chances of there being any kind of relationship whereby the group might be at all affected by a consensus position by all of the groups that you saw up there is pretty much eliminated. Mm-hmm. So if you're wrong about that, or if it's on the border between being part of the group and not, I mean, that's very persuasive to show all of those Islamic religious opinions that suggest they are not Islamic. Although it'd be interesting to know, do they use the words not Islamic, or do they use just saying this is not representative of our tradition, this is outside anything that's within the mainstream, along those lines. So I'm wondering whether the label makes that much of a difference, as long as if you keep them inside the religious tent, you're still able to isolate them in a corner and say, you may claim whatever you want, and there may be some affinity between the principles that you have and our principles, but we condemn what you do, we eschew your behavior, and we're going to treat you as a pariah group.
In answering that, the reality is that whether or not they're able to affect that group is, I would venture to guess, is less important to these groups who are disavowing than what that group is doing to them. Mm-hmm. So on election day this past week, there was a drive-by shooting at a mosque in California. Nobody died, but there were bullet holes in that mosque now. Whenever there's a terrorist attack, people who are Muslim or people who people just think are Muslim get beat up and berated. Attacks on Muslim houses of worship have gone on the rise in the past 4 or 5 years for any number of these instances. So it's less. I can see the argument you're making that yes, if you completely cleave them from the herd, then your ability to affect them is limited in some regard. Mm-hmm. But I think more important to them is less how they're going to be able to affect this group, and more what this group is doing to affect them, because they're dispersing and defaming their entire religious tradition in ways that they feel every single day. And so that's a way that is very real for a lot of these Muslim communities. There's a lot of questions.
Now we move to the back and hit the
back into the line.
About the Islamic State, it's not Islamic, and of course it's not a state, right? We understand that it's not a state because we have some characteristics for it to state. That's not even a state, and of course, but the word says that Islamic State. When it's not a state, so the debate is not on the state thing, but the debate is on Islamic thing. They're not. I mean, I'm a Muslim. I'm horrified with whatever they do, as a Christian is horrified, or as a Jew is horrified. I mean, the things that they do is completely inhumane, and so it is the responsibility of the civilized world to distinguish between the Islamic State's Islam or the mainstream Islam, because this creates this misconception, and and I think the civilized world are the educated people that talk about these things, and if they don't distinguish between the Islamic State's Islam and the mainstream Islam, it's like it will not represent a good Islam to other people. Mm-hmm. And one more thing is that I'm forgetting the one more thing.
We can circle
around. Why don't we field the movement?
If I remember that.
Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I have a question about, it seems clear that the best argument for the Islamic State being Islam is this postmodern thought of being able to self-identify. Mm-hmm. But it seems like that conflates self-identifying who you are with self-identifying a group or also an association and also action. It doesn't seem like in normal postmodern thought we normally are allowed to self-identify our action or identify our actions as being categorically something, or same with groups. For instance, I can't join with 4 people here and say we're a corporation now because we self-identify as a corporation. There's actually steps we need to take, mm-hmm. Even in a postmodern world. Similarly, the reason we aren't calling it a state, the Islamic State, we all agree it's not a state. So it seems to me that the discussion that we've been having is accepting this ability to self-identify as a group or self-identify group action as well as Islamic. When we could say, yes, you are each Muslims, but that doesn't make the group a Muslim group or the action that they're taking Muslim action.
And that nuance is a very important one. The difference of saying that you as a group are not Islamic or you as individuals not Muslim. And that goes very directly into specific theologies about whether or not you could justify someone's ability to claim on whether or not they are Muslims. And what's interesting about your comment earlier about the folks who are up on the wall, every single group up on there had a specific critique about whether or not the Islamic State was Islamic. There was some critique that was offered either in the letters that they signed on to or in the statements that they made. People have been far more hesitant to say that these folks are not Muslims. Now, that might sound like a different, semantics, but it's not to them. And so what's interesting to me, and while I'm willing to say that ISIS is not Islamic, these folks are not willing to say that they're not Muslims, and they're still trying to figure out how to have a conversation about that. And the fact that they're avoiding that question to begin with, I think is telling. So I'm going to be in violent agreement with you and say that I think that's like a really good point and a really good nuance.
We have one more? Yeah.
I was going to talk about how I think that that sort of back and forth effect, where one group, where we initially, I think it made perfect sense to say that, by keeping them in the same tent, we can exert some sort of influence over the greater Muslim community, can exert some influence over. But the point here is that Islam is not that kind of religion. It's not that kind of construct. It's a decentralized thing, and so the pushback is that there's going to be an equal and opposite reaction. Essentially, is how that plays out. It sounds like in a hierarchical tradition that I'm Mormon. The Mormon Church had a big problem with polygamy a long time ago, and finally they said, we're stopping all polygamy. Well, groups split off and said, we're going to keep doing this. We're still Mormons. The main group said, no, you're not. Period. Cut off. And now it's not really this thing. If it wasn't, that's probably a product of its centralized nature. If it wasn't centralized, if it was decentralized, you'd have the same. If they can claim. Basically, the problem that's being brought up now is that you brought up is that label can go, as long as it can be claimed like that in a postmodern sense, then the characteristics of the person, whoever's claiming it, becomes part of the shared thing that has to be sorted out on a case-by-case basis and not categorically.
Yeah, and I think your point about the way that Islam functions is why this is a difficult question for a lot of people. Because if there was like a Muslim pope who said like, nope, not Islamic anymore, you could disagree with the pope, but you'd be disagreeing with that authority as opposed to like the category itself. And this is why it has to be a larger conversation amongst a disparate group of people who believe very different things, even within the corpus of Islam. And it's also why the other gross overgeneralization of Talal Assad that I mentioned earlier is sometimes people would say that he just said that you can't define religion, like it's a fool's errand, because at some point it dissipates into a point where you can't distinguish one from the other. But for operating in the world and being able to for the very real lived experience of people who are being affected by ISIS, both in Iraq and Syria and outside, there has to be some sort of substantive and efficacious conversation. So while they are not, this is my perspective on this, but I think it's echoed in their statements. While they do not have a central authority that ISIS has to care about, they at least can have a conversation that allows the rest of Islam to come in alignment about something.
The only other thing I would add is just that we've had a series of different kinds of arguments for why you would cleave off the Islamic State from Islam. One is that this internal debate within Islamic communities about how to come to some consensus on that. The other that you mentioned is the sort of external empirical effects of keeping them in or out. Mm-hmm. And that's a very different question, right? So you're saying, well, if we keep them in, there's more likely to be attacks on mosques in other parts of the world. To me, that's an empirical question, and we, might be able to look at a number of different circumstances where a group is completely on the outside, as opposed to when it's kept on the inside, and then we see what sorts of harm are there. But those are two separate kinds of inquiries, and nevertheless, they both need to get aggregated together in some way to make the assessment about inside or outside groups.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
We're out of time. Thank you so much for coming, and thanks to our panelists. Great discussion.